concerning your prophet Daniel. Lord, have your way. In Jesus' name. Amen. I kind of already gave it out, but anybody remember what book we're doing? It's only been 7 weeks, I think, since we started this. So I kind of feel like I need to recap chapter 1. It's been so long. This is a really amazing book. First time I've got a chance to teach on this, and really gotten into it. There's a lot of good stuff. Also a lot of weird stuff, and there's a lot of teachings out there that do some weird stuff with this book. So I have a goal tonight, as we get into this, is to get to the idea of, okay, what is the theme of this? Of what is Daniel trying to get across to us with this book, and also kind of hopefully clarify the role of prophecy when it comes to, particularly we're in Daniel 2, particularly with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and so I want to hopefully bring some clarity to it. There's a lot of different opinions out there. We're going to tackle a couple of those tonight, but my goal is not to deal in opinions. I want to deal with what did Daniel have in mind when it came to this writing, and it's something that we really need to. It really comes to life when you understand how the book is written. So when we look at Daniel, and this is something that's quite interesting about the book of Daniel, is that it's written in 2 different languages. This is your first blue question there with a fill in the blank. Does anybody know what 2 languages Daniel was written in? Might be able to guess one of them. Pretty easy if you know. Hebrew, there's one. Close. Aramaic. Hebrew and Aramaic. So chapters 1, okay, and technically the first couple verses of 2. But your paper says chapter 1, and 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew. Chapters 2 through 7, starting in about 2 verse 3, are written in Aramaic. Now, there's a reason for that, and if you look to the way the whole book is structured, is the chapters that we have that are written in Hebrew are generally talking mainly about the people of Israel. The introduction chapter that we went through, talking about, Nebuchadnezzar and coming and taking the youth of Israel and training them up. And then you get into the last 4 chapters, which have a lot to do with what's Israel's place throughout the rest of time until the culmination of the kingdom. Chapters 2 through 7, though, are written in Aramaic. Aramaic was the commoner's language of the Babylonian Empire. It was what was generally spoken. You had a couple different languages. You had what they called Neo-Babylonian, which was more the rich elite, and then you had Aramaic, which was the common language at the time. So what's interesting about that is, and scholars believe, is that chapters 2 through 7 were actually available to the Gentile, the Babylonian, for them to understand what was going on, for them to actually read and comment on, which is very important when we think about what the theme of Daniel is. And hopefully as we get into this, we're going to start to develop that theme as we go. Okay? So when it comes to 2 through 7, you're going to learn a new word here today. Okay? This 2 through 7 are written, okay, as a chiasm. That's chiasm. Okay, a chiasm. Now, what is a chiasm? Good question. So, chiasm is a literary device. It's a way that writers use to basically position different parts of a passage. Sometimes there's little micro chiasms in passages, where it's basically you have a parallel going on. So when you have in Daniel, is you have chapters that are parallel with one another. So in this next section, chapter 2 parallels with chapter 7. Chapter 2, we have as we're going to talk about, the statue with the four different materials. Okay, and then we have the 4 beasts talked about in chapter 7. Okay, that's important because that's going to help us get to the understanding of what chapter 2 is talking about. I'm not going to dive too far into 7 because I don't want to mess somebody else's teaching up later on. But it helps us understand what Daniel's getting the point because of the way it's written. Chapter 3 and 6 are parallel with one another. Chapter 3, the 3 Jewish boys and being thrown into the fiery furnace parallels with Daniel being thrown in the lion's den, the persecution of God's people. Okay, they parallel with one another. Okay, and then you have chapter 4 parallel with chapter 5. You have God judging Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, and in chapter 5 you had God judging Belteshazzar for his arrogance and not giving God honor. So that's important. You see, there's a certain structure that Daniel had in mind as he was writing this, and that's how Jewish thought works when it comes to when we read the Bible, we tend to read it like a history book sometimes in the way we think of history. A, B, C, this happened. These are the details. That's the way our history books are written. But the Jewish people, they did history too, and the Bible is definitely historic. But they had a much different way of writing history. There's so much intention in the way stories are put and placed next to each other in the Bible, and that's important for us to understand so that we can come to a good, understanding of what. And this is the next one. What the meaning of the text is. So knowing this is key to arriving at the correct meaning of the text. Now I want to define meaning because meaning can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What I mean by meaning today is what Daniel's intended meaning was when he wrote the text. That is what I mean by meaning. Not what it means to Bobby or what it means to Brian or, that I think of that more like significance. Okay, of how is it significant to me? And what was the Holy Spirit speaking to me in it? That's not the kind of meaning I'm talking about. Why do you think it's important for us to come to that meaning before we figure out, okay, what is God speaking to me about it? Why do you think it's important for us to figure out what the author is trying to say? I'm going to ask a lot of questions like this, by the way. I like open-ended questions. So there's no wrong answer. I like to get some thought, give you guys to kind of just, get some, put some thoughts together. Why is it important for us to grasp that? Why can't we just open the book and just go, oh, I like that verse. It speaks to me. Yeah. Gives us a foundation. Definitely. Is it possible that we can really get things out of whack if we don't understand what the author actually was meaning by a passage? It happens all the time. There's a lot of crazy doctrines out there that get created because we don't take the time to get to know the author. That's exactly right. Definitely. And I would go a step further. I think it's honoring the Word of God because God had a specific way of going about his Word, and he chose people with personalities, with, their own backgrounds, their own understandings, their own worldviews. It's the ultimate divine partnership. It's a perfect picture of how God wants to work with us and co-labor with us. The Bible was written by people who, he worked through, inspired them through their own faculties to write this. So to take away from not to get to the meaning of what the author meant is to dishonor God's intended way of bringing his word about to us. So it's a heavy thing that we have to take as we get into this. So let's get into this. So I've got a couple readers here. I've got, Kim, if you don't mind starting for me, we're going to start chapter 2, verse 1. We're going to rock this out.
In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what the dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me.
Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, he was fun at parties, I bet. So a couple little things here, just to give us a little background, a little understanding. Okay, we left Daniel chapter 1. The last couple chapters we talked about, last couple verses, we talked about, Daniel being given, the gift of all these gifts and all us understanding. And mainly one of the big ones that's highlighted, it kind of sets us up for what we're going to see in chapter 2, is that Daniel was given the ability to interpret all kinds of dreams and visions, right? So here we go. Nebuchadnezzar, he seems like he's off the wall, but what do you guys believe Nebuchadnezzar's motive behind challenging his court? What do you think his motive was in challenging his court in this way? So he had an expectation that they should be able to fulfill this. Okay. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, it's good stuff. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Terry? I think you were reading my notes. And that is the idea. These guys have been part of his court, right? These aren't the new shipment of people that he's brought in quite yet. These people have been part of his court, and yeah, he definitely. It wouldn't have been the first time that he probably asked for counsel from these guys, but yeah, he didn't need yes men at this point, right? He didn't need someone to tell him what he wanted to hear. This dream really, it really messed with him. It caused him, insomnia. It caused him insomnia. It's kind of funny to think of dream keeping you up, but when we look at what's going on, he couldn't. It shook him. He knew this was something that was big. He probably couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew it was big, and definitely he didn't need yes men at this point. He definitely needed the truth. Now, do we think that this was he overdoing it with the charge that he was trying, that he was, telling him that, either you tell me this dream or, you're all going to die? We would think so. But that's actually that was actually a very common way. And that's what I have here. Being cut into pieces, having your property destroyed was the common punishment for the average criminal. That's what's written there in the blue for your 2 spots there. It was the common punishment for the average criminal. Mm-hmm. Definitely, and we're going to see that in this next part. So, Brian, if you can go ahead and read that next section for me, verse 7 through 11.
Is it?
Do what? Did it print wrong? Yeah, should be a front and back there. Oh, did you see the front? Oops.
They're out there on the.
Sorry, guys.
One moment.
No problem.
All right.
That was my fault. I didn't print enough copies, so can't blame.
Okay, 7 through 11.
Yes.
So once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I formally decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's only one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans."
So your question here, what are the implications of the astrologer's statement in verses 10 through 11? They make a pretty strong statement there, right? No, the astrologers answered the king, "There's no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." So what are they saying there? What's the Yeah, it has to be from the gods, right? Well, go ahead. They don't hear from their gods. It's like, well, but wait, what do they do? Right? I mean, these guys are the ones that supposedly are supposed to be the ones doing these incantations and I think the term in the Hebrew for enchanter is like soothsayer priest is the way. So these are guys that are the enchanters are the priests of their time, and they're basically saying there's nobody can help. Only the gods can. And the gods don't live here with man, so they're of no use to us. They can't help you with this. That's a big theological statement to make on their part. And I would believe that would probably really mess with Nebuchadnezzar, and I think it does. So we're going to keep going. Verse 12 through, I think we're at 12 through 18.
This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him and with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time, so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to the house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon.
All right, so a lot to unpack in this section. So right off the bat, it made the king so angry and furious. So we kind of touched on this. Their statement basically completely discredits their whole vocation, right? Everything that they have done up to this point, they've just stated has basically been a lie. They haven't, the gods aren't speaking to them and giving them this understanding. The gods don't dwell here. How can they give so I could imagine Nebuchadnezzar was very angry at this point. And we see it begin to come to pass. Now, in verse 14 describes Daniel as being as someone who speaks with wisdom and tact. It's a very interesting two-word pair right there. In the Aramaic, in this is very similar to the Hebrew. Wisdom is described as being something that's an innate quality. So it's the idea of wisdom is something that you have. Tact, though, is a way of using the wisdom. It's a way of actually putting the wisdom to action. So Daniel not only had the wisdom, but he knew how to use it. Unlike Solomon later in his life. I think that's a great example of another man in the Bible who prayed for wisdom and God gave it to him, and he did okay for a while, but he misused that wisdom, and it led to the kingdom eventually being split by his sons. So that's something to see that Daniel here is not only, given the wisdom of God, but he's using it well. Something to keep in mind, and this is a lot of debate, because we see here in verse, let's see here, we're in verse number 16. It says that this Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. So if anybody is familiar with Esther, we understand that it is a capital offense to just go in and see the king. And as we see later on, it seems that when Daniel does it, after he gets the interpretation, he goes in, the king doesn't seem to know who he is at that point. So a lot of scholars have some disagreements, some arguments about this. Most likely, Daniel didn't actually go and see the king here. He probably talked to what we would think of as the equivalent of like a secretary, to set an appointment, right? So he wants to get a time to talk to him. So it's just to kind of clear that up, because if you read it in sections, you miss that. But if you go through, I'm like, wait, didn't he already see the king? Why is Arioch introducing him? And so more than likely, he didn't actually see the king here. In the next section, we see that, Daniel comes back afterwards, after he already said, hey, give me some time, I'm going to get the interpretation. Then he goes to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and asks for prayer. Why did he wait till then? Why did not before? Why did he wait? Why do you think Daniel only prayed with his friends after he had agreed to interpret the king's dream? They serve the same God. Do what? Slow the execution? Definitely. That's a good point. Yeah. They serve the same God. Yeah. It may teach us something about the way they viewed prayer. Definitely. Daniel was a very devout student of Jeremiah's writings. So Jeremiah, there's definitely, these guys were trained most likely during the time of Josiah's reign, when Josiah had this huge sweeping religious reform and, tore down all the altars of Baal and started a school, what a lot of times referred to as the Deuteronomistic school after the book of Deuteronomy, but it was to teach the law again and to train up young people in the law. And most likely Daniel and the other three grew up in that school. So these guys had a solid foundation, and they had this, believe they had this understanding of the way prayer works. And there was feet that they put to the ground, trusting, knowing that God was going to come through, because God said that his people would prosper in the foreign land. Jeremiah encouraged us, go build houses, have families, be a blessing to Babylon. So he knew they had an understanding of how God was going to come and come to their aid in this time, and that's important to grasp as we cover and we get to the point of like, what is Daniel trying to build here? What kind of theme is he trying to get across to us? So in this next little part, Daniel's request sought the well-being of all the wise men of Babylon. In the NIV, it says here, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. It's more like along with the rest of them. So he was seeking mercy, not just for him and his buddies. He was seeking mercy for all the other pagan, Shamash and Nebo worshiping, enchanters and all of them. He was seeking mercy for all of them. Goes back to his understanding as a disciple, almost a long distance disciple of Jeremiah. He understood that the Jewish people were supposed to be a blessing to the nation, and God would protect them. So he sought the well-being of not just himself, but all of the wise people of Babylon. Let's go ahead and move on to this next section, one of my favorite parts. I think that's verses 19 through 23.
Okay. So during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You've made known to me what we asked of you. You've made known to us the dream of the king."
Now we get to what Daniel's been hinting at in this whole, up to this point. Babylonians, this is your first blank. The Babylonians believed that their gods had no control over history. That their gods were, they really didn't know what to do with their gods most of the time. They every time usually blame them for things that went wrong. They figured they just made the gods mad. So let's go and give offerings to hopefully make them happy again so things will go right. But their understanding of the way their gods worked was very different than the Jewish people. They believed they didn't, and we see that obviously as they said it themselves, that their gods they didn't dwell with man. They believed that they created the world and just kind of, step back and, okay, worship me. But Daniel acknowledges God's sovereignty, sovereign, Ty, over all of history. This is where we start to see the theme that's been hinted at in this chapter start to develop. Is unlike the gods of the Babylonians, Daniel's God, our God, he's the one that changes the times and the seasons. And remember, this was written in Aramaic, so the Babylonians could read this. Okay, this is this doxology that we're seeing, this word, this praise that Daniel's given. He's giving this in a way to make a point. This is what my God is capable of. He changes the times and the seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. I love, the aspect of all these things. But what's really cool here, as you see in the beginning, and there's a little parallelism here. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. What does it say in verse 23? This is the parallel verse to that. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. Wisdom and power are yours. You have given me wisdom and power. Whose God doesn't walk with man? Who doesn't dwell with men? It's not the God of Israel. Because the God of Israel has given me wisdom and power, and he's present now. So he's hitting two. Well, he's not only a God that's over everything, but he's also a God that's here and present and is enabling me. Big statement that really, is right in the face of what the Babylonians would be, thought of their gods. And then it just gets better. as we get into this. So let's go ahead. Let me get my notes to get to the right page. Do what now? Exactly. It's exactly the opposite. So let's keep going here. Verse 24 through 28.
Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means." The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come."
But there is a God. Every time I get to that part, I get chills. But there is a God. So, cool little note here. Daniel made Arioch's day. We don't see that as much in the English here, but where in the Aramaic, that where it says at once, so it's the Daniel in verse 25. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once. It actually is the idea of being excited. So he was like, "Yes, let's go." This is the guy who was going to have to execute a whole bunch of people, and now his whole schedule got freed up. So I think that's a cool little side note. He was super excited. Another little thing just to keep in mind, this is based on in different translations, but it is important to note in verse 28, the end there, where it says, "What will happen in days to come?" It's actually better to think of that as the end of days. And some of your translations may say like the end times or the last days or the latter days, for you King James folks out there. But it is the end of days. But really the point, and Daniel drives this home over and over again. This is here on your sheet for you to write in. Is that Daniel makes it clear to the king that the true God is one who both gave him the dream and the interpretation. So he makes the note that he didn't just have an interpretation that like the other ones would have given him an interpretation, but it was the true God, the God that is the one who reveals mysteries. He gave him gave him both. He's taken himself out of the picture here. God gave both of these, both your dream and your interpretation. Okay, so now let's go ahead and read this next section here. I have part of 28, your dream, and then we'll go to 30, maybe 35. Yeah.
Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of clay and partly of baked clay. Partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron and the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain that filled the whole earth.
All right. So what's cool to note here at the beginning is Daniel doesn't just tell what the dream was. He also tells Nebuchadnezzar what he was thinking about before he had the dream. And I think that's important to note. And it's funny because the last time I taught, I think it was in Acts, and it was Peter's vision of the sheet coming down from heaven and with all this food for him to eat. And he was hungry, right, at the time when he had that vision. And it's, again, a note to understand that a lot of times God will use a lot of the imagery that we see in these dreams that are talked about in the Bible. And even as God speaks to us, if any of you guys are, have ever experienced a dream from God, a lot of times it may not be too far off of something that you've been dealing with or maybe thinking about. A lot of times those dreams work in tandem with what your current experience may be. And we see that here, Nebuchadnezzar is a frugal king, hopefully. He was thinking about the future of his kingdom, right? What's going to come? What's going to happen? And here in that midst of thinking about the future, God gives him this dream about the future. What's interesting about dreams, though, in the Old Testament is actually the Jewish people viewed that as a lower form of, revelation. If you see when Daniel referred back earlier, God gave him the interpretation in a vision of the night, not a dream. Two different words in the Hebrew most of the time. So understand that the dreams of the pagan kings, like the Pharaoh and so on, those were usually considered the lower form of interpretation. The visions were preserved for the God's elect people. Little side note there. What's important to know, and this is going to get fleshed out in this next section, though, is the word for statue here. It's the same word. It's an Aramaic, very similar word to the Hebrew for image. And some translations actually say image. But it's what we would say, and a lot of times you see the word idol in the Old Testament. It's the same word, but it's also the same word in Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Same word. And that's an important note because the Genesis 1 and 2 it's a common motif throughout the Old Testament. Over and over again, the Old Testament authors touch on and hit back and refer back to aspects of Genesis, okay? So what's important to see here is that we see this man-made image, okay, which that's why idolatry is so hated by God, because he created us to be the image of God. But instead of us fulfilling that, we created our own images to follow. And so it's a slap to the face of God. It's not so much we're worshiping that instead of him, and that's an aspect, but it's also taking the very nature of what he did in creating us and saying it's not enough for us to be the image of God. I need to worship this image. I need to create my own image to follow. So here we are. We have this man-made image, okay? That's your first part. It was completely destroyed by a God-made rock. The aspect following Genesis, you see the pattern a lot, is there's creation and then there's decreation. We had the creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and then we hit back in Genesis 6, decreation, the flood, wipe it away. And that pattern happens over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament in different ways. When judgment comes, the sons of Korah and the rest of his family, the judgment came upon them when they were fighting back against Moses. Well, what judgment happened? Well, decreation. The ground that was supposed to be there, it opened up, swallowed them. You see that motif happen over and over again in the Bible. So what we're seeing is God kind of following that. Man created something, okay, in his own image, and God's decreating it. Let's go ahead and get into this next part, 36 through 43.
This was a dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you rule over them. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay.
All right. So I included a chart here, and it's probably, I think it's on the second page for you guys. I included this just to give you the two common interpretations. I'll use that word, interpretations. I'm gonna show you a chart, and then I'll tell you why it's really not useful. But these are the two commonly held understandings of the dream that scholars, I would say a lot of people, some scholars follow, of being, what's what. Obviously we know the head of gold is Babylon. Then there's the fight between whether the arms of silver in the chest is the Media, or what a lot of times we hear it as the Mede-Persian Empire, the Persian Mede Empire. The stomach and thighs of bronze. At that point, you're like, okay, if Persia is not, fitting up there in the silver, then it's got to be the bronze. If Persia's up there with silver, then Greece is going to be bronze. And then you have the legs of iron, which is either going to be Greece or Rome, depending on how the Persian Mede thing, if you can, kind of falls out. Why? Here's something interesting, and I included a little on the very last page. I included a little timeline for you, kind of give you an idea of just, this is a timeline of Daniel's life. And here's something that's interesting. Daniel could have included, if, let's say one of these were right. We know Daniel lived during the Mede and the Persian empires, and possibly the Greece, as well, as Greece was taking over Persia. So why do you think Daniel didn't go back and just write in their names there? We see it in other parts of the Bible. We see editors that have put together parts. We see Jerusalem mentioned in Genesis. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years before Jerusalem existed, to refer to a certain area. It was common to do that in Jewish literature. It wasn't bad. It wasn't go back to this was just bringing some light to what was going on. A good part of Exodus, was, if Moses, there's a lot of ideas of, whether Moses had wrote it or not, but we do know that he probably didn't write the part about him dying. Right? And it was definitely not an uncommon thing. It was definitely acceptable to go back and edit and make changes. Why didn't, if these were the interpretations of these, why didn't Daniel go back and put them in there? Any ideas? Sure. And what I mean, though, is Daniel was alive during a couple of these kingdoms. So it would have been within him, if three of them at least could have been during his lifetime. I have an idea. It's not the point. It never was the point. The point of the dream was not what part was what bronze represented or what gold, it wasn't the point. The point is God wins. What happens to those kingdoms? They don't just fall. They're atomized in the dream. It says they're like chaff, dust. They're gone. I mean, it's not just like, they're gone. They're completely and utterly destroyed. And then it says God's kingdom comes, it's like a rock and then becomes a mountain and covers the whole earth. What's interesting about that? You know what Babylonians thought of when they thought of the earth? You know what picture came to mind? A mountain. When they pictured the earth, it was a mountain. So here's God's kingdom destroying all these kingdoms, and then becoming a mountain, taking over everything. The point was that it doesn't. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, your gold. You're up here. Your gold. You're so much more valuable. So and then there's going to be these inferior kingdoms and whatnot, and then there'll be this iron kingdom that'll have some issues, But at the end of the day, God's kingdom is going to come and just destroy them all and take over. God wins in the end. God's over you all. His sovereignty is over you all. That's the point of this dream. That's the point of what Daniel's trying to say is it doesn't matter. God's going to win. What I find interesting about this is that all of these kingdoms are present when God's kingdom comes. And I can tell you, Greece isn't around anymore, and neither the Persian Empire and all that. I mean, there's some little tidbits, in there. None of them are around. It leans itself to the idea of systems of government. The Jewish people talk about Babylon a lot. If you read the book of Revelation, John is all about, the imagery of Babylon. It goes way back to the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babylon. It's this idea of an oppressive, regime that steps and crushes people and takes advantage of people and enslaves people. The idea of God coming and destroying all of that. And his saints will rule with him. We see that come out in Daniel chapter 7, the parallel chapter. It talks a lot about that. So it's that destruction of that oppressive kingdom. God wins in the end. Let's finish this out here. Let's go. I think, I'm almost there. I think we can finish this. Am I good, Pastor? All right. So 44 through 45, I think is where we're at.
At the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. It will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end. But it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy.
I just noticed I got a little excited. I got ahead of myself in my notes there. That's okay. So, the dream God gave the king was an ultimate declaration of his sovereignty over the nations. He's sovereign over the kings. We see that happening later on in messing with Nebuchadnezzar's mind and dealing with Belteshazzar. We see him sovereign in the lives of his people and saving Daniel and saving the three friends there. We see him here really portrayed as being sovereign over history and over the nations. And that's important. And he makes a point to say, nor will it be left to another people. What does he say about all the other kingdoms? One gets taken over by the next, and then the next one takes that one over, and the next one takes that one over. Every kingdom, even yours, Nebuchadnezzar, is going to be left to somebody else. But God's kingdom is not going to be left to anybody else. He's the ultimate. He's it. Finish this out. 46 through 49.
Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court.
So why do you think Daniel, at this point, allowed the king to, in a sense, worship him? Because we think of a lot of things that might come to mind. I don't know about you, but I think of Paul and Barnabas and that whole ordeal. You know, they were attempted to be worshipped, and they ripped their clothes off. And what do you, we're just men. You know, think of why does it seem like Daniel's fine with this? I believe me, I studied it out. I couldn't. You can't. I mean, incense is. I mean, this is what you do to worship in that area, in that way. Why did Daniel allow it? What was going on here? Yes. Yeah. Right there. Yeah. Did you? Yes, definitely. And we see later on in the book of Daniel, I think it's Belteshazzar himself that says, speaks of Daniel as being one who has the spirit of the gods. So there is this picture of Nebuchadnezzar worshiping the God in their mind. He has the spirit of the God, of this God, obviously. So that's the worship. And Daniel recognized that. But it's also a picture of, we see that it was, again, this is in Aramaic, so everybody can read this. The fact that the king is falling prostrate before an exile from a captive nation. We've just dealt with God's sovereignty overall here, right? And here it looks, this is what it looks like. The lowest of the low is being worshiped by the king and then exalted up. It's a picture here of what God's planning for his people, the Jewish people. This would have been a great encouragement to the Jewish people that would be reading this, and that they would see what's going on in their kingdom. So I'm finished. I'm tying this in together. So what do we come up with? What's the theme here? What is Daniel? What's the big overarching theme of this portion of the book of Daniel? I said it like 12, 13, 14 times. It's kind of God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty in the lives of his people, in the kings, in the authority above the nations, right? History. So that's all great and good. And this is a little teaching on interpreting, because this is the point of interpreting scripture. When we're learning and we're studying it, we've got to get to the bottom. Okay, what's the author trying to say? Then we can say, okay, now what does that mean to me? I was listening to a lecture, because that's what I do in my free time. It wasn't even that to do with school. It was just because I wanted to. But my wife's like, yeah, that's true. And it was hermeneutics, which is interpreting the Bible properly. And this Dr. Robert Stein was teaching. He was using an example. He was talking with a buddy of his back in the 80s who was a missionary in Ethiopia. And in the 80s in Ethiopia was a communist nation, and there were Christians that were dying. And the missionary asked Dr. Stein, what do you think their favorite books of the Bible were? And Dr. Stein was like, well, I thought, maybe Mark, gives a good idea of, the power of Jesus and who he is. And then maybe Romans, it's the Roman road, and gives us a good idea of, justification and all that good stuff. Maybe Mark, Romans, maybe, I don't know, Luke. And the missionary responded, he said, no. He said, Daniel and Revelation. And immediately Dr. Stein kind of was like, oh. Because a lot of times especially in the scholarly, especially if you do a lot with hermeneutics, you realize a lot of people mess those books up. And there's all about charts. That's why I kind of think I put a chart in your book, but it's all about charts, and this represents that, and this represents that, and this is the timeline, and this is when the bowls happen, this is when it's all about that. And so Dr. Stein was a little put off, and the missionary saw his facial expression. He was like, it's just because in the end, God wins. And it's what the people needed to know. Is regardless of the persecution they were dealing with, regardless of the struggles they were experiencing in the end, God's in control and he wins. And because he wins, they win. So, guys, whatever you're going through, Daniel has a message for you. God wins. Because God wins, you win. Thank you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it, enjoyed the teaching. And let's have a good night. Father, we're so thankful for you. We're so thankful that you win. It's what you do. And Lord, as we go about our day and go into our evening and we reflect over everything that is going on in our lives, every challenge, the things that keep us up at night, the things that stress us out, Lord, bring to remembrance the message Daniel was trying to get through, is that in the end, you win. You have the final say. You are sovereign and you are present. Lord, we thank you. We give you glory and honor. Lord, I ask you to bless everyone under the sound of my voice this evening and guide us through the rest of our week in a worshipful, mindful way, that we would acknowledge your sovereignty as we go about our days. In Jesus' name. Amen. Have a good night, guys.